Commander David Kane had seen his share of diplomatic nightmares in his 15 years with the Terran Federation. But Meridian Station was setting new records for creative ways to make everyone miserable. The massive rotating habitat spun lazily against the star field, its artificial gravity generators humming with the kind of low-frequency vibration that made your teeth ache after prolonged exposure. Kane navigated the sterile corridors with practiced efficiency, dodging clusters of nervous diplomats and trying to ignore the way conversations died whenever he passed groups discussing the Velthara delegation. "Whatever you do," Ambassador Morrison had said that morning, cornering Kane near the coffee dispensers with the urgent intensity of someone imparting state secrets. "Don't talk to them. Don't even make eye contact if you can help it. One wrong gesture, one misinterpreted word, and we could have another border war on our hands." Kane had nodded dutifully while wondering if Morrison realized. He was gripping his coffee mug hard enough to crack the ceramic. The man had been jumping at shadows ever since the Velthara delegation arrived 3 days ago, and his paranoia was becoming contagious among the junior staff. The problem, as Kane understood it, was that nobody really knew how to handle Queen Selenira and her heir, Princess Lyrelei. The Velthara Empire had been humanity's primary adversary for over a decade, their crystalline-skinned warriors and telepathic abilities making them formidable opponents in both battle and negotiation. This summit represented the first serious attempt at peace talks, and everyone was terrified of being the person who accidentally triggered Galactic War III by using the wrong fork at dinner. Kane's personal tablet chimed with his daily assignments: monitor cultural integration protocols, review atmospheric requirements for mixed-species gatherings, and ensure that human and Velthara personnel maintained appropriate social distances. In other words, his job was to make sure nobody talked to anybody else, which seemed like a peculiar way to conduct diplomacy. "Fascinating approach to interspecies relations," he muttered, scrolling through regulations that read like instructions for handling radioactive material. "Maybe next we can try communicating through interpretive dance and hope nobody starts a war over incorrect pirouettes." The central plaza of Meridian Station buzzed with controlled chaos as representatives from dozens of worlds attempted to navigate the complex social dynamics of a peace summit. Environmental fields shimmered throughout the space, creating atmospheric pockets suitable for various physiologies. Kane watched a group of Centaurian delegates engaged in animated discussion with their Altarian counterparts, 4 arms gesturing emphatically while gills fluttered in apparent agreement. At least some species could manage civilized conversation without triggering interstellar incidents. Kane was reviewing his checklist when movement near the main elevator banks caught his attention. The crowd seemed to part automatically, creating a clear path through the plaza as 2 figures approached. Even at a distance, they were unmistakably Velthara, tall, elegant beings whose crystalline blue skin caught and refracted the station's artificial lighting in subtle patterns. Queen Selenira moved with fluid grace that made Kane think of water flowing uphill, while Princess Lyrelei matched her pace with the unconscious synchronization of someone who'd been trained in royal protocols since childhood. Their elongated ears, delicately pointed and mobile, swiveled constantly as they walked, monitoring conversations and ambient sounds with obvious intelligence. Kane found himself studying their faces, noting the high cheekbones and large eyes that gave them an otherworldly beauty that was both attractive and slightly unsettling. The most striking thing about their progress through the plaza was the absolute silence that followed in their wake. Conversations didn't just pause, they died completely, leaving an uncomfortable quiet that made the station's background hum seem unnaturally loud. Diplomats pressed themselves against walls and ducked behind environmental barriers, their body language screaming, "Please don't notice me," with painful clarity. Kane felt a stab of something that might have been sympathy. Whatever else the Velthara might be, telepathic, politically dangerous, capable of influencing local gravitational fields with their emotional responses. They were also clearly isolated in a way that seemed more lonely than regal. Commander Kane, a nervous technician, appeared at his elbow, tablet in hand and expression suggesting imminent panic. "We're getting complaints about atmospheric pressure in Section C. The Velthara delegation says there are pressure disturbances, but all our readings show normal parameters." Kane tore his attention away from the royal pair, who had reached the observation balcony and now stood silhouetted against the star field like living sculptures. "What kind of disturbances?" "That's the problem. They won't specify. Just keep requesting correction of environmental anomalies. Engineering is baffled because our sensors aren't detecting anything wrong. Have you considered that their sensory capabilities might exceed our detection equipment?" Kane suggested, pulling up atmospheric data on his tablet. "The Velthara are known to perceive gravitational fluctuations that our instruments consider negligible." The technician's expression shifted from panic to thoughtful consideration. "You mean they might be detecting micro-variations in the artificial gravity field?" "It's possible. Schedule me for a direct inspection of the environmental systems in Section C. If there's something our sensors are missing, we need to identify it before it becomes a bigger problem." As the technician hurried away, Kane glanced back toward the observation balcony. Queen Selenira and Princess Lyrale remained at the railing, their backs to the plaza as they gazed out at the stars. Something in their posture suggested contemplation rather than arrogance, but Kane forced himself to look away before his observation became obvious staring. Morrison's warnings echoed in his mind. "Don't talk to them, don't make eye contact, don't risk any interaction that might be misinterpreted." The smart thing would be to complete his atmospheric inspection remotely, file his reports through proper channels, and maintain the safe distance that everyone seemed to think was essential for preventing interstellar war. But watching the way other personnel gave the Velthara royalty such a wide berth that they might as well have been radioactive, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that sometimes the safest approach wasn't necessarily the right one. If they were going to build lasting peace between their species, somebody was going to have to risk actual communication eventually. The question was whether that somebody should be a mid-level cultural protocol officer, whose biggest diplomatic achievement to date was successfully mediating a dispute between Rigelian traders and the station cafeteria over proper preparation of fermented algae dishes. Kane's tablet chimed again with another atmospheric complaint from Section C, this one noting that the pressure disturbances were increasing in frequency. He sighed and headed toward the maintenance levels, wondering if environmental engineering might be a safer career choice than interspecies diplomacy. Behind him, Queen Selenira and Princess Lyrale continued their silent vigil at the observation deck, their isolation stark against the backdrop of stars that had witnessed both war and the fragile hope of peace. Kane found himself glancing back once more before disappearing into the maintenance corridors, unable to shake the impression that they seemed less like dangerous aliens and more like two individuals carrying the enormous weight of their species' future. The atmospheric readings in Section C were going to require his personal attention, and Kane had the distinct feeling that this inspection might lead to more than just equipment calibration. Sometimes the most important diplomatic breakthroughs happen not in conference rooms, but in the mundane spaces where real work got done, and where people, regardless of species, had to find ways to solve problems together. Whether Morrison would approve of that philosophy was another question entirely. 3 days into what Kane was privately calling the diplomatic summit of mutual avoidance, he found himself elbow-deep in the guts of a malfunctioning gravity generator, while Chief Rodriguez explained the station's environmental problems with the enthusiasm of someone describing a particularly virulent plague. "The thing is," Rodriguez said, handing Kane a quantum flux calibrator that looked like it had been assembled by a committee of drunk engineers, "our sensors keep saying everything's normal, but the Velthara keep filing complaints about pressure disturbances. Yesterday, they submitted a 17-page technical analysis of atmospheric irregularities that our best equipment can't even detect. Kane adjusted the calibrator settings and peered at the gravity generator's diagnostic display, which was currently showing readings that made about as much sense as Centaurian poetry. Maybe their enhanced sensory capabilities aren't just propaganda. If they can perceive gravitational fluctuations at the micro-level, they'd notice things our instruments miss. That's what I'm thinking, but try explaining that to Morrison. Yesterday he suggested we just ignore their complaints and hope they go away. Rodriguez wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of lubricant that made him look like a very tired warrior. Easy for him to say. He doesn't have to listen to them describe every tiny atmospheric variation like it's a personal insult to their respiratory systems. Kane was about to respond when he became aware of a subtle change in the maintenance area's ambient sound level. Conversations had stopped with the abrupt finality of a power failure, replaced by the kind of silence that usually preceded either explosions or diplomatic incidents. He straightened slowly, still holding the flux calibrator, and turned toward the entrance. Queen Selenira and Princess Lyrale stood at the threshold of the maintenance bay, their presence causing the 3 technicians working nearby to freeze like startled deer. The alien's crystalline skin seemed to pulse with subtle bioluminescence in the area's harsh work lighting, creating patterns that were beautiful and slightly hypnotic. Kane waited for them to speak, to issue royal commands or lodge formal complaints about environmental conditions. Instead, they simply observed his work with intelligent curiosity, their elongated ears twitching occasionally as they monitored the various sounds of diagnostic equipment and whispered conversations from the paralyzed maintenance staff. Rodriguez muttered under his breath, Should we do something, like bow or offer them chairs or maybe just run screaming? Let's try not panicking, Kane replied quietly, returning his attention to the gravity generator while trying to ignore the weight of alien royal scrutiny. They're probably just investigating the atmospheric complaints themselves. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Kane worked to recalibrate the generator's quantum field harmonics. He was acutely aware of being watched by beings who could supposedly read minds and influence gravitational fields through emotional responses, which seemed like a particularly stressful combination of abilities to be on the receiving end of. The diagnostic display finally showed green across all parameters, and Kane felt a small surge of professional satisfaction as the microfluctuations in the artificial gravity field smoothed out to acceptable levels. The atmospheric pressure reading stabilized, and even the subtle harmonic distortions in the environmental processors seemed to settle into more regular patterns. When Kane glanced up from his work, he caught Queen Selenira giving him a brief nod of what looked like approval before she and Princess Lyrale turned and glided away with the same fluid motion that had brought them there. No words, no formal acknowledgement, just that single gesture that somehow conveyed more meaning than most of the diplomatic speeches Kane had endured over the past week. Did that just happen? Rodriguez asked once the royal pair had disappeared from view. Did the Queen of the Velthara Empire just approve of your repair work? I think so, Kane replied, still staring at the empty doorway, though I'm not entirely sure what that means for my continued employment prospects. The aftermath of the encounter rippled through the station's rumor networks with the speed of quantum-entangled gossip. By the time Kane returned to his office, he'd already received 3 messages from Morrison demanding an immediate briefing on his unauthorized contact with hostile alien royalty, 2 requests from junior diplomats asking for advice on proper Velthara etiquette, and 1 congratulatory note from an engineer who'd heard he'd successfully communicated with telepathic aliens through the universal language of mechanical competence. Kane was reviewing the atmospheric data from his repairs when his personal communicator chimed with an official message from the Velthara delegation. His heart rate spiked as he opened the communication, expecting either a formal complaint about protocol violations or a politely worded death threat. Instead, he found a simple request. The Velthara delegation specifically requested his continued involvement in environmental systems monitoring for the remainder of the summit. No explanation, no additional details, just an official preference for his services over those of the other available technicians. Well, Kane muttered to his reflection in his office's viewport, this is either the best career move I've ever made or the most elaborate way anyone's ever gotten themselves fired. His contemplation was interrupted by Morrison bursting through his office door with the wild-eyed intensity of someone who just discovered his junior staff were conducting unauthorized alien diplomacy through mechanical repairs. Kane, what the hell did you do down there? I just got word that the Velthara royalty specifically requested you for ongoing environmental maintenance. Do you have any idea what kind of political implications? I fixed a gravity generator, Kane interrupted calmly. They were complaining about atmospheric pressure irregularities. So I investigated and found microfluctuations in the artificial gravity field that were too subtle for our standard sensors to detect. After the repairs, the complaint stopped. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, concern, and what might have been grudging respect. You mean they weren't just filing frivolous complaints to be difficult? Apparently not. Their enhanced sensory capabilities allowed them to detect genuine problems that our equipment missed. They were actually trying to help us identify safety issues. Kane pulled up his diagnostic reports and turned his tablet toward Morrison. The fluctuations I found could have cascaded into serious structural problems if left uncorrected. And they communicated this to you how, exactly? Through telepathic technical specifications. Kane thought about the Queen's approving nod and the Princess's intelligent observation of his work. More like professional recognition. Sometimes expertise transcends language barriers. Morrison sank into the chair across from Kane's desk, looking like someone whose worldview had just been gently but firmly rearranged. So you're telling me that instead of dangerous alien monsters plotting humanity's destruction, we're dealing with competent engineers who happen to have blue skin and telepathic abilities? Among other things, yes. Though I suspect there's considerably more complexity to their culture and motivations than we've been assuming. Kane closed his diagnostic reports and leaned back in his chair. Maybe the real challenge isn't avoiding them. Maybe it's learning to work with them. Morrison's going to love that theory, Kane thought to himself as his superior left the office with considerably more to think about than when he'd arrived. Through his viewport, Kane could see the distant outline of Velthara transport vessels maintaining their precise formation in the station's defensive perimeter, their crystalline hulls reflecting starlight in patterns that seemed almost like signals. Tomorrow would bring new environmental challenges, more atmospheric complaints, and probably additional opportunities to discover that the galaxy's most feared telepathic warriors were also apparently conscientious about proper life support maintenance. Kane found himself looking forward to the work with an anticipation that had nothing to do with career advancement, and everything to do with the simple satisfaction of solving problems with beings who appreciated competent engineering. Whether that attitude would survive his next encounter with Velthara royalty remained to be seen, but Kane was beginning to suspect that the most dangerous thing about Queen Selenira and Princess Lyrale might not be their telepathic abilities. It might be their tendency to challenge every assumption humans had made about their species. The emergency evacuation drill that changed everything started like most bureaucratic disasters, with good intentions, poor planning, and a computer system that had apparently developed a sense of humor at the worst possible moment. Kane was reviewing atmospheric pressure readings in the central observation lounge when the station's AI announced in its maddeningly cheerful voice, Attention all personnel. Initiating scheduled emergency evacuation drill. Please proceed to designated safe areas according to established protocols. What the AI failed to mention was that its definition of designated safe areas included sealing multiple sections of the station simultaneously, trapping groups of personnel in random locations while the safety systems ran through their diagnostic routines. Kane found himself locked in the observation lounge with an eclectic mix of diplomats, maintenance staff, and much to everyone's apparent horror, Queen Selenira and Princess Lyreley. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Ambassador Morrison pressed himself against the far wall as if the Velthara royalty were radioactive, while junior diplomats scattered to the furthest corners of the lounge like startled fish. Several technicians actually hid behind furniture, which would have been amusing if it weren't so professionally embarrassing. "This is wonderful," Kane muttered, pulling out his communicator to contact station security. Nothing says successful diplomatic summit like trapping terrified humans in a room with supposedly dangerous alien royalty during a safety drill gone wrong. His first 3 attempts to reach security resulted in busy signals, suggesting that the malfunctioning drill had created similar problems throughout the station. Kane switched to emergency maintenance channels and finally got through to Rodriguez, who sounded like he was juggling approximately 17 crises simultaneously. "Kane, thank God. We've got lockdown failures in 47 sections. The AI is apparently having an identity crisis, and half the station's diplomatic corps is trapped in their quarters demanding immediate rescue by armed escort." "Let me guess," Kane said, watching Morrison attempt to communicate with the other trapped humans through elaborate hand gestures. Nobody thought to test how the emergency systems would interact with mixed-species environmental requirements. Worse, the safety protocols assume all personnel are human, so they're not accounting for Velthara physiological needs. The Queen and Princess are probably experiencing atmospheric distress, but nobody knows how to adjust the environmental controls for their species. Kane glanced across the lounge at the Velthara royalty, who stood near the central viewport with their characteristic calm dignity despite being surrounded by humans who were clearly terrified of them. Their elongated ears twitched occasionally, monitoring the nervous conversations and whispered prayers for quick rescue. "Rodriguez, I need you to walk me through accessing the environmental control interface from this location. If the system lockdown is causing atmospheric problems, we need to fix it before this drill turns into a real emergency." "You sure about that?" Morrison's been pretty clear about avoiding unauthorized interaction with the alien delegation. Kane looked around the lounge at his fellow humans, who seemed more concerned with maintaining safe distances from the Velthara than with solving the actual safety problems. At this point, I think unauthorized problem-solving beats authorized panic. Working with Rodriguez through the comm system, Kane managed to access the environmental controls through a maintenance terminal. The atmospheric modification subroutines are nested within the gravitational field generators, Kane explained, more to himself than to her, which is the kind of design decision that makes perfect sense until you actually need to modify one without disrupting the other. To his surprise, Princess Lyreley reached out and began manipulating the interface with fluid precision, her enhanced reflexes allowing her to navigate the complex menu systems far more efficiently than Kane's human limitations permitted. Within moments, she had isolated the atmospheric controls and was making subtle adjustments to pressure and gas mixture ratios. Working together in concentrated silence, they managed to optimize the environmental conditions for both species while simultaneously restoring normal lockdown protocols. Kane found himself caught up in the rhythm of collaborative problem-solving, calling out system parameters, while the princess implemented changes with telepathic speed and accuracy. "Pressure differential normalized," Kane reported to Rodriguez through his communicator. Trace gas concentrations within acceptable parameters for mixed species requirements. How's the lockdown situation looking from your end? Much better. Whatever you did, it's working. Lockdown protocols are disengaging station-wide, and we're not getting any more complaints about atmospheric distress. As normal lighting returned to the observation lounge, and the sealed doors slid open, Kane found himself standing beside Princess Lyreley at the maintenance terminal, both of them slightly out of breath from the intensity of coordinated technical work. Around them, the other trapped personnel were filing out with obvious relief, most of them still avoiding eye contact with the Velthara royalty. Queen Selenira approached her daughter and Kane, her expression unreadable but somehow conveying approval of their collaboration. She spoke for the first time in Kane's presence, her words flowing through the station's translation system with melodic precision. Competence transcends species barriers. This is a foundation upon which understanding can be built. Kane felt his cheeks flush with something between embarrassment and pride. Just doing my job, Your Majesty. Emergency situations require practical solutions, regardless of protocol. Indeed, the Queen replied, her large eyes studying Kane with what seemed like genuine interest rather than royal assessment. Perhaps protocol should serve practical necessity rather than the reverse. As the royal pair departed the observation lounge, Kane became aware that several other personnel were staring at him with expressions ranging from awe to terror. Morrison looked like he was torn between promotion recommendations and charges of treason, while the junior diplomats seemed to be taking notes on proper emergency collaboration techniques with telepathic alien royalty. Kane, Morrison said as the lounge cleared, I think we need to have a very long conversation about your interpretation of cultural protocol guidelines. Probably, Kane agreed, shutting down the maintenance terminal and gathering his equipment. Though I'd argue that successfully preventing atmospheric emergencies during diplomatic summits falls well within my job responsibilities. Later that evening, Kane received another official communication from the Velthara delegation. A formal commendation for exemplary technical competence and collaborative problem-solving during emergency conditions. The message was signed by both Queen Selenira and Princess Lyreley, making it the first documented case of Velthara royalty jointly endorsing a human's professional performance. Kane stared at the commendation for a long time, thinking about the way Princess Lyreley had worked alongside him without hesitation, her focus entirely on solving the problem rather than maintaining political distance. For those few minutes during the crisis, species barriers had dissolved into the simple necessity of two competent individuals working together toward a common goal. Maybe that was what real diplomacy looked like. Not formal speeches and carefully negotiated treaties, but moments of shared purpose when artificial barriers became less important than practical solutions. Kane filed his incident report and made a note to request expanded training in Velthara environmental requirements. If he was going to keep accidentally breaking diplomatic protocol through effective emergency response, he might as well do it with proper technical knowledge. The explosions that shattered Meridian Station's peaceful diplomatic atmosphere came without warning, turning the final day of negotiations into a nightmare of twisted metal and failing life support systems. Kane was reviewing atmospheric data in the central plaza when the first blast rocked the station's superstructure, sending diplomats and staff scrambling for emergency stations while debris rained from the ceiling. All personnel to evacuation stations, the station AI announced with uncharacteristic urgency. Critical systems failure in fusion reactor core. Repeat, all personnel proceed immediately to escape pods. Kane's training kicked in automatically as he helped injured civilians toward the nearest evacuation routes, but his mind was racing through the technical implications of what he'd just heard. A fusion reactor failure on this scale would mean catastrophic containment breach. the kind of disaster that would vaporize the entire station and everyone aboard it within minutes. Through the chaos of panicking evacuees, Kane spotted familiar figures moving against the flow of fleeing personnel. Queen Selenira and Princess Lyrale were heading toward the reactor core instead of the escape pods, their crystalline skin pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that Kane had never seen before. "Where are you going?" he shouted over the wail of emergency sirens, abandoning his assigned evacuation route to intercept them near the main engineering access corridor. "The fusion containment is failing," Queen Selenira replied, her translated words barely audible over the station's death throes. "Our telepathic abilities can interface directly with the reactor's control matrix, but the process requires precise technical coordination." Kane understood immediately. The Velthara intended to manually stabilize the fusion reaction using their mental capabilities, essentially becoming living circuit breakers to prevent the catastrophic explosion. It would probably kill them, but it would save the thousands of lives aboard the station. "You'll need someone who understands the technical systems," Kane said, making the kind of split-second decision that either saves lives or gets everyone killed. "I'm coming with you." Princess Lyrale turned to stare at him, her large eyes wide with something that might have been surprise or respect. "This is not your responsibility, David Kane. Your species has no obligation to risk death for ours." "Maybe not," Kane replied, following them into the engineering section as another explosion shook the station's framework. "But competent technical support is my responsibility, and right now you need someone who knows how these systems integrate." The reactor core was a maze of twisted conduits and failing containment fields, with emergency lighting casting everything in hellish red shadows. Kane could feel the radiation levels climbing as they approached the central control chamber, where the fusion reaction was building toward critical instability. Working with desperate efficiency, the three of them established a triangle around the main control console. Queen Selenira and Princess Lyrale placed their hands on the telepathic interface nodes, while Kane accessed the technical controls, his fingers flying over diagnostic displays as he identified the specific systems that needed stabilization. "Containment field fluctuations at 47% of nominal," Kane called out, sweat beading on his forehead from a combination of stress and radiation exposure. "I need you to focus telepathic pressure on grid sections 12 through 18, while I reroute power from the backup generators." The process was unlike anything Kane had ever experienced. He could feel the Velthara's mental presence in the system, their consciousness somehow merging with the reactor's quantum field matrices to impose order on the chaotic energy patterns. It was beautiful and terrifying, watching two beings literally sacrifice their life force to prevent a catastrophic explosion. For long minutes they worked in perfect synchronization, Kane providing technical adjustments while Queen Selenira and Princess Lyrale used their abilities to manually regulate exotic matter flows that no human technology could control. The station's death throes gradually subsided as the fusion reaction stabilized, containment fields strengthened, and power levels returned to safe parameters. By the time emergency teams reached the reactor core, all three of them were collapsed on the deck, exhausted and suffering from various degrees of radiation exposure. Kane's vision was blurry and his hands shook from neurological damage, but he was alive, and more importantly, so were the thousands of people aboard Meridian Station. Medical teams swarmed the area, treating radiation injuries and checking for contamination, while station security investigated the sabotage that had triggered the crisis. Kane learned later that a radical human faction opposed to peace negotiations had attempted to destroy the station using stolen explosives, apparently believing that eliminating both delegations would prevent any treaty from being signed. As Kane sat on the deck beside Queen Selenira and Princess Lyrale, all three leaning against each other for support in exhausted camaraderie, He reflected on the irony that terrorists trying to prevent human-Vilthara cooperation had instead created the perfect conditions for it. Nothing built trust quite like risking your life alongside someone, regardless of what species they happen to be. "You chose to help when you could have fled," Queen Selenira said, her voice weak but carrying genuine warmth through the translation system. "This is the foundation upon which peace is built, not words in treaties, but actions in crisis." Kane managed a tired smile. Seemed like the practical thing to do. Besides, somebody had to make sure you didn't accidentally overload the quantum flux regulators while you were performing telepathic reactor maintenance. Princess Lyrale laughed, actually laughed, despite her obvious exhaustion. Human humor in the face of potential death. Your species has interesting survival mechanisms. "We're full of surprises," Kane agreed, then winced as a medical technician began treating his radiation burns. "Though I'd prefer to keep future diplomatic breakthroughs to situations that don't involve potential vaporization." The aftermath of the crisis transformed the entire dynamic of the peace negotiations. Kane found himself promoted to senior cultural liaison, specifically requested by the Vilthara delegation for all future diplomatic missions. The incident report praised his exceptional technical competence and willingness to risk personal safety for interspecies cooperation, which looked impressive on his personnel file, but failed to capture the simple truth that he'd acted without thinking about politics or protocol. 3 weeks later, Kane sat in his new office reviewing the final peace accords that had emerged from the summit. The document was a masterpiece of diplomatic language, full of formal declarations about mutual respect, technological cooperation, and shared security interests. But Kane knew the real breakthrough had happened in a reactor core during an emergency, when 3 individuals from different species had worked together to prevent disaster. "Commander Kane." Princess Lyrale appeared in his doorway, no longer the distant royal figure from the beginning of the summit, but a colleague and, Kane dared to think, a friend. "Do you have time to review the new environmental safety protocols? I want to make sure they account for both human and Vilthara physiological requirements." "Of course," Kane replied, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "Though you might want to double-check my calculations on the atmospheric pressure differentials. I'm still learning the finer points of cross-species environmental design." As they worked together on the technical specifications, Kane reflected on how far they'd all come from those first days of careful avoidance and diplomatic paranoia. The protocols they were designing would ensure that future mixed-species facilities could accommodate everyone safely, preventing the kind of problems that had initially brought them together. "David," Princess Lyrale said, using his first name with the casual familiarity that had developed during their collaboration, "my mother wanted me to tell you something. In our culture, when someone risks their life to save others without expectation of reward, we consider them family. You are welcome in Vilthara space as an honored relative, with all the privileges that entails." Kane felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. That's an incredible honor. I'm not sure I deserve it." "Deserve is irrelevant," she replied with a smile that was both alien and somehow familiar. "You acted with courage and competence when it mattered most. That makes you one of us, regardless of what species you were born into." As Kane watched Princess Lyrale review environmental specifications with the same focused intensity she'd brought to reactor stabilization, he realized that the most important diplomatic achievement of the summit hadn't been the formal treaty or the trade agreements. It had been the simple discovery that competence, courage, and concern for others transcended species barriers. That trust could be built through shared action rather than careful words. The final line of his incident report had noted that successful interspecies cooperation requires individuals willing to work together despite artificial barriers. Kane had meant it as a professional observation, but sitting in his office with a Vilthara princess who called him by his first name, and trusted him with critical safety decisions. He understood that some barriers existed only as long as people chose to maintain them. Outside his viewport, Velthara and human ships moved together through space in the careful formations of a new alliance. Their combined